das Wort gebe. Jeffrey Sachs ist nach wie vor Professor an der Columbia University in den Vereinigten Staaten. Er ist Special Advisor, also besonderer Berater der UN-Generalsekretäre Ban Ki-moon gewesen und jetzt Gutierrez. Er hat initiiert die erste zivilgesellschaftliche Friedenskonferenz im Vatikan im Sommer 2022 und hat dort mit Unterstützung des Vatikans, des Papstes, einen Friedensplan, den ersten Friedensplan auf den Weg gebracht. Und seitdem, würde ich mal sanft vorsichtig formuliert, tourt er für den Frieden durch die Welt und versucht bei vielen, vielen internationalen Events für den Frieden zu werben. Er war beim G20-Gipfel, er war auch beim G7-Gipfel und anderen und wirbt dafür. Und ich freue mich sehr. I'm really happy, Jeffrey, that you could make it today, that you could join us. I think for us in Germany, it's an important peace conference. And I will give immediately the floor to you. Only one sentence before, ein Satz davor. Wir machen das mit den Dolmetschern. Wir haben jetzt sogar 2 Dolmetscherinnen in Häkchen. Sogar 2, die, also alle, die englischsprachige Hilfe, Unterstützung brauchen, bitte wieder aus meiner Sicht nach hinten links. Dort steht die Katrin und die Mona und werden versuchen, euch zu übersetzen und dass ihr so viel wie möglich mitkriegt. Jeffrey, I was explaining that we have a whistling translation in the corner. And now I give the floor to you. I have shortly introduced you, and now the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure for us. And
thank you. Thank you so much, and warm greetings to everybody. I'm connected by my phone from Beijing, so let's hope that the connection holds up well and that you can hear me. I'm very grateful for the chance to be with you today, and I'm grateful for the chance anytime to discuss peace, especially with you in Germany, where it's so important for Germany and for all of us to get this right, because we have not gotten this war right, unfortunately. I believe we're in a kind of end stage right now. It's a very dramatic moment. Maybe our mainstream media don't fully appreciate it, but we have some crucial decisions to make just in the next weeks. Here's why. Ukraine is in terrible trouble. The counteroffensive has failed. The devastation to Ukraine has been immense. It's really been a bloodbath. Ukraine has been worn down terribly by this failed counteroffensive, with massive loss of people and a massive loss of hardware. And Russia is probably going to launch a major counteroffensive, and a very dangerous one, very soon. That's not for sure, but I think that that is likely. And I think the consequences for everybody, starting with Ukraine and Europe and the world, could be very, very grave if we don't move to negotiation now to save Ukraine first and foremost. Now, my view has been all along that this was a war that could have been avoided at many points, that it is a war caused basically by the US idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and even to Georgia on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. It's an old US idea. It's even an older British idea, because it was basically the British imperial idea of the Crimean War to remove Russian power from the Black Sea. And Brzezinski in the 1990s revived this idea, and our neoconservatives in the United States have tried to put it into place for more than 25 years. So this is a war that has deep roots in US unilateralism and neoconservatism. This is not how the war is portrayed in our media, which absolutely deny people the history that they need. As everybody knows, I'm sure, in this room, Hans Dietrich Genscher and James Baker were very explicit with President Gorbachev. NATO will not move eastward. The United States cheated. Germany went along with it. And the eastward expansion of NATO started under Clinton. And it accelerated under George Bush with 7 new NATO members in 2004. But the huge, decisive moment was pushing Ukraine's membership in NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And we know that Chancellor Merkel was very much against this, as were most of the European leaders. But frankly, European leaders don't stand up to the United States, just like your chancellor today never stands up to the United States, I'm afraid. And so when the US pushed for a commitment for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia, even though the European leaders knew this was deeply dangerous and misguided, and our own US diplomats knew that this was dangerous and misguided, NATO went ahead with this commitment because the US pressured all the rest of the leaders. And so Ukraine's membership in NATO was promised. This has proved to be devastating for Ukraine. When Yanukovych became president in 2010, he wisely called for neutrality. And neutrality was passed by the Rada, and it became the state law. Then, of course, as you know, the neocons in the United States aimed to overthrow Yanukovych. And however you depict the Maidan revolution of dignity, it was a US regime change operation to a significant extent. This is obvious for anybody that cares to look. Again, our media deny the obvious. It happens that Russia intercepted a call of Victoria Nuland that explains it all, because 3 weeks before the violent coup that overthrew Yanukovych, Victoria Nuland was already choosing the new government of Ukraine. So as soon as Yanukovych was overthrown, President Putin retook Crimea so that Sevastopol, the naval base of Russia since 1783, would not fall into NATO hands. And two breakaway regions of Ukraine rejected the coup-led government, which was a Russophobic Western Ukrainian government, hostile to Russian ethnic Ukrainians. And these two provinces broke away, Donetsk and Lugansk, and violence broke out. The war started in 2014. And of course, the Minsk agreements were negotiated to stop the war. And Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement. But as even Chancellor Merkel told us in interviews last year, nobody took the Minsk agreement seriously in the West. Russia took it seriously, but neither Ukraine, nor Germany, nor the United States, nor France took it seriously. And so the autonomy that was promised for the Donbass was not followed through by the Ukrainian governments. Instead, the United States started to arm a massive army, beginning really with the arms buildup in 2018 and 2019. And this army threatened, as your generals have made clear, to storm the Donbass in 2021 and early 2022. This is the truth. This is not Putin propaganda or Putin apology. This is the US neoconservatives pushing NATO against Russia's red lines and knowing that war would come from this. Even there's a video of Zelensky's senior advisor, Arestovich, in 2019, very clearly saying, we know that pursuing NATO means war with Russia, but we're ready for war with Russia. So we knowingly provoked this war because of this desire to end Russia's great power status by surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. And the plan all along was that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would completely surround Russia and the Black Sea. And this would, in the theory of Brzezinski and going back to the 19th century, make it impossible for Russia to project its power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. On December 17, 2021, as you know, President Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement to avert the war. And the agreement called for several things, but the most important was an end to NATO enlargement. I personally called the White House after that agreement was put onto the table and really urged President Biden to negotiate. But the US position, and it is the formal NATO position, is that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. This is the so-called open door policy, that only NATO and the counterpart, in this case Ukraine, have any say in NATO enlargement, and Russia's interests have no bearing whatsoever. This is sheer reckless arrogance. That's America for you. And this is how we get into wars, because we refused to negotiate over the expansion of NATO. Now, mind you, think of the context in which Russia viewed this. First, the United States had unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and the United States was putting missiles into Central and Eastern Europe, starting with Poland and Romania. Russia vociferously objected. The United States said it's none of your business. The US, of course, launched wars repeatedly. Serbia, 1999, Afghanistan, 2001, Iraq, 2003, Syria, 2011, Libya, 2011, Ukraine, 2014, with the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. The US refused to negotiate on any of these matters. The US unilaterally built a massive army in Ukraine. This is what Russia saw and faced in early 2022. I'm just explaining this war. I'm not justifying it, I'm explaining it. We walked eyes open into a war. Of course, the United States thought that the sanctions regime, that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system would bring down the Russian economy. This was stupid, but this was the belief of senior US officials. Senior US officials thought that Putin would not mobilize in Russia, that he would be politically too weak. This was, again, extraordinarily naive, because from Russia's point of view, this question of NATO enlargement is an existential question. It's not just a minor point. It's an existential question. So the United States provoked this war. Putin launched the special military operation. within 2 weeks, Zelensky called for negotiations based on Ukraine's neutrality. And as you know, at the end of March, there was actually a document about to be signed by Russia and Ukraine based on neutrality, and that would have ended the war. The United States intervened and stopped that agreement. Do you read about it in the mainstream media? No. But this is what happened. And I've spoken to the negotiators, and I flew to Ankara to get a proper briefing about all of this. And I've spoken to many people about this. And the United States blocked this because the United States said to Zelensky, you can defeat Russia. You don't have to accept neutrality, because this project of NATO enlargement was the project of Biden, Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan. And your government has stood up and cheered all the way, especially your foreign minister, as has much of Europe. It's very sad. Now, what was clear from the beginning is that the sanctions would not crush the Russian economy or prevent Russia from prosecuting this war. It was also clear from the beginning that the so-called wonder weapons of NATO would not be sufficient if Russia chose to fight a war of attrition, because Russia is much larger than Ukraine, because Russia's military industrial complex is even proportionately larger than Ukraine's. And because for Russia, this was not a small issue where Putin was just going to go away. This was an existential issue. And so again, our generals so frequently do exactly what they've done in Ukraine. All my life, US generals have said victory is just around the corner. They said it in Vietnam. They said it in Iraq. They said it in Libya. They said it in Syria. They said it in Afghanistan. And they said it in Ukraine. Don't worry, everything's under control. But clearly, where we are today, nothing is under control. Ukraine has suffered grievously on the battlefield and in the destruction of infrastructure and in the flight of 10 million people or more, and in the annexation of vast territory with many millions more, and with so many dead and wounded each day and week. And the United States just keeps saying, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. And you know, our senators have the audacity to say, we're getting our money's worth because no Americans are dying, we're weakening Russia, and we're showing China that we're strong. This is actually what grown-ups in the United States say. It's hideous. How can a senator say such a thing? So profoundly immoral and so profoundly stupid, by the way. Russia's not being weakened by this. Russian military is being strengthened by this. We're not showing China how tough we are. We're depleting our arsenals and showing that Russia can take on the NATO military armaments and hold them at bay. And what does fighting in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians conceivably have to do with showing China that we're tough? The very idea is appalling. But actually, I'm quoting the senior members of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. This is the line that actually the politicians in Washington use, that this is about China. And in the meantime, Ukraine is in desperate shape. Now, let me say that the situation is even more adverse because the awfulness of this is dawning on more and more people. In the elections yesterday or today, I guess, yesterday or today, because it's time zone difference, in Slovakia, yesterday's election, sorry, a government was just brought to power that ran the campaign on the basis of stopping all support for Ukraine. Poland has announced it's stopping all support for Ukraine. Hungary, of course, has opposed this adventure all along, saying that this was a neocon illusion, not some pro-Ukrainian initiative. So Ukraine is losing its support in Europe one by one. There is not a senior politician in a Western European country that has an approval rating higher than the disapproval rating. Western European politicians are all unpopular. This war is deeply unpopular. The economic boomerang effects are deeply unpopular. What this has done to the German economy is deeply unpopular. And the US blowing up Nord Stream didn't help. So Europe has pulled back. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you probably saw that the United States Congress rejected Biden's call for more financial support for Ukraine in the last-minute maneuvers yesterday that kept the US government functioning with the so-called continuing resolution. That's a kind of stopgap legislation that is passed to keep the government going for another couple of months while the deeper budget debate continues. But President Biden was trying to put in $6 billion of short-term help for Ukraine into that continuing resolution. And it failed. In fact, the continuing resolution succeeded only when the money for Ukraine was taken off the table. And this is because the Republican Party in the United States, both in the base of the membership of the party in the United States and increasingly in the leaders of the party in Washington, are opposed to more spending for Ukraine. Now, they have mixed reasons for this. Some is fiscal policy. Some is that they want to spend the money to fight China, not to fight Russia. Some just don't believe in the war. There's a mixed set of motives, but the Republicans do not want to fund this war anymore, and the Republicans control the lower house of our Congress. So that's another reality. So if you add this up, Ukraine having lost in its counteroffensive, losing support in Europe, losing support in the United States, and facing the prospect of a massive offensive by Russia, that's still only a hypothesis, but it's a possible one. What to do? Well, if you are Britain, it's clear. Britain says we should escalate. Britain is sending British military to Ukraine now for on-site training. The British, in my view, are a little crazy, still with the nostalgia for their empire, still fighting the first Crimean War, they think. So I try to put this British view away because it is a nonsense and a danger. What we need to do is not to escalate further, which could end up with the full destruction of Ukraine or an escalation to nuclear war, as we know. We need to understand that all of this all along has fit Clausewitz's famous formulation that war is the continuation of politics with other means. We need to face the politics of this issue. This is a war over NATO enlargement and an internal war between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. And the way that could have kept Ukraine safe and secure would have been neutrality and diversity, a federal structure for Ukraine, recognizing the Russian language and Russian culture, and not having a culture conflict as well as a NATO enlargement. But we've gotten the worst of both worlds, pushing NATO enlargement and a Russophobic Western Ukrainian regime absolutely spewing hate, maybe understandable, but hate against Russia that is totally destructive of peace prospects. So we need to come back to the politics. And in my mind, the politics are roughly the following. I think that there are at least 4 components to a peace agreement. The first and fundamental one is stop NATO enlargement eastward. Stop already. This is so dangerous and provocative. And it's, since Ukraine's not going to join NATO, to keep promising that it will when the war is over means perpetual war or outright defeat of Ukraine. So stop NATO enlargement. Stop this absurdity of this so-called open door policy. Understand that NATO enlargement does concern Russia and that Russia should have a say in this. And that we should remember the promises that Genscher and Kohl and Baker made back in 1990. Anyway, this whole approach has been wrong, driven by US unipolar aspirations. So the first point is stop the NATO enlargement as part of a peace agreement. The second is very difficult now, what to do about the territories. You know, in 2014, Russia wasn't claiming any territories. Then Yanukovych was overthrown and Russia, it just claimed the Minsk II agreement. But then the Minsk II agreement was repudiated, so Russia claimed the territory of the Donbass. We keep refusing common sense, and the situation keeps getting worse and worse. At this point, there does need to be border change negotiated. And we have to understand that sometimes borders do change. The United States forced a border change of Serbia to put Kosovo out of Serbia. That was a NATO operation, bombing Belgrade for 49 straight days in order to change the border. And the United States did the same with Sudan, siding with the insurgency of South Sudan to change the border. So we're going to have to negotiate borders to reach peace. Crimea certainly is going to remain in Russian hands. The heavy ethnic population, Russian ethnic populations of Ukraine are going to be in Russian hands in the end if we want peace. So that's a second point that I think is obvious. A third point is the United States and Russia need to get back to nuclear arms negotiations. The US never should have abandoned the ABM treaty. The US never should have abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which it did in 2019. Now the New START treaty is in suspension. We need the nuclear negotiations to resume. And the United States has to accept that Russia is right, actually, about this danger of the placement of Aegis missiles without negotiating with Russia. This is destabilizing the nuclear situation. So that's a third plank that is needed. And a fourth plank is to return to the concept of collective security of the OSCE. Because the OSCE is based specifically on the point that no country can choose a military alliance in a way that endangers another country. Unlike the NATO open door doctrine, so-called, that NATO doesn't have to talk to Russia, the whole OSCE is premised on collective security, that no country can take measures that jeopardize a neighboring country. And this is the right point. OSCE is truly Europe's best path for security. I should mention, by the way, that while I was against NATO enlargement all along, I would be very clear, NATO will not retreat from where it is, but it will stop expanding. NATO should not, in these negotiations, leave the Baltic states or leave Romania or Bulgaria or others. No, it can't do that. But it can accept that it will stop the Eastern enlargement. Finally, let me say that while it seems impossible today, I firmly believe that normal relations with Russia should be established between Germany and Russia, and in fact, between the European Union and Russia. And by normal relations, I mean trade and finance and tourism and culture. This idea that we are siding to never again speak with Russia or listen to Rachmaninoff or play a Tchaikovsky ballet or have a Russian soprano sing in our opera houses is reprehensible, in my view. What are we doing? We made a terrible political mistake to go deeper and deeper into conflict with Russia rather than operating with respect and actually with consistency. We crossed Russia's red lines knowingly and repeatedly. We overthrew a government in Ukraine. We don't admit any of this, by the way, in the mainstream media. I'm attacked every day for simply repeating the historical truths. So be it. I don't care. These are the truths. And this is the way to peace. We need to understand this is politics, and we need to return to politics. This issue will not be solved. Ukraine will not be saved on the battlefield. Thank you very much.